In the 19th century, a shocking number of Victorian doctors believed they had found a cure for everything from insomnia to depression, and it wasn't a pill. It was sex. Imagine walking into a clinic. Not for romance, not for scandal, but for a prescription. One that would make even the boldest blush today. How could a society so obsessed with modesty secretly endorse such an intimate remedy? And why did some physicians claim this treatment could save lives? Stay with me until the end, because every detail of this forgotten medical practice will change the way you think about Victorian medicine, and about what a doctor's visit could mean. It's strange, isn't it? We imagine the Victorian era as a time of rigid manners, whispered conversations, and a constant need to appear respectable. The men in tall hats, the women in corsets and long skirts, everything about their image seems to shout propriety. And yet, behind closed doors, some doctors were quietly writing prescriptions that would make even a modern audience raise an eyebrow. I still remember the first time I came across this in an old medical journal, buried between polite discussions of diet and sleep. There it was. A recommendation for sexual congress as a therapeutic intervention. Not whispered between lovers, but typed in black ink by men with serious faces and impressive mustaches. The logic, they claimed, was simple. Many ailments, especially in women, were caused by nervous congestion or hysteria, and the surest way to relieve it was a controlled release of sexual energy. Now, I'm not here to shock you just for the sake of it. The truth is, this was medicine by their standards, medicine wrapped up in outdated science, social biases, and a touch of wishful thinking, in a time when women had little say in their own health care. These prescriptions were as much about control as they were about cure. Some physicians genuinely believed they were helping, others, perhaps, enjoyed the blurred lines between science and intimacy a little too much. If you think this sounds like a rare, fringe idea, think again. In certain cities, it wasn't uncommon for a physician to quietly suggest such a remedy, especially for cases of melancholy, insomnia, or fainting spells. There's something unsettling and oddly fascinating about the fact that a society obsessed with modesty could also make space for this deeply personal form of treatment. And that's just the beginning, because when we dig a little deeper into why Victorians thought sex could heal the body, the story gets even stranger. To understand how such a prescription could exist, we have to step into the Victorian mind, and that's a place where science, morality, and superstition often lived in the same room. Medicine in the 19th century was still finding its footing. Germ theory was young, antibiotics didn't exist, and the human body was often explained through poetic metaphors rather than hard data. Doctors believed in vital energy, an invisible force that needed to flow freely for a person to stay healthy. If this energy became blocked, symptoms like fatigue, anxiety, fainting spells, or what they called female hysteria could appear, and in their eyes, one of the most efficient ways to restore balance was sexual release. Of course, they didn't describe it with the same frankness we do today. They wrapped it in respectable language, talking about relieving congestion or promoting circulation. For women, especially those from the upper classes, a doctor might recommend marital intimacy as a gentle encouragement to fulfill one's wifely duties that, conveniently, were now being framed as essential to good health. Looking back, I can't help but notice how this reasoning was a product of its time. Women were rarely the authors of their own medical narratives. Their bodies were studied, diagnosed, and treated according to male interpretations. Some of those interpretations were laughably off base, others quietly sinister, but they all grew from the same soil, a mixture of limited medical knowledge and deep-seated social norms. And here's the thing. While some physicians genuinely saw this as an act of care, others surely recognized its moral convenience. It reinforced the belief that a good wife should be available to her husband, not just for companionship but for her own supposed well-being. In that sense, the prescription was as much about preserving the social order as it was about curing an ailment. But theory is one thing, and practice is another. And when it came to applying this so-called cure in real life, the methods could be stranger, and sometimes far more awkward than you'd expect. Now, here's where the story moves from curious theory to the kind of practice that makes you stop and think. Wait, they really did that? In Victorian clinics, A treatment for hysteria could range from the discreet to the downright bizarre. For married women, the most respectable route was to be told, quite plainly, to spend more intimate time with their husbands. The doctor would phrase it delicately, marital engagement, or increased conjugal relations, but everyone in the room knew what that meant. Husbands often welcomed the advice, wives, well, their enthusiasm was not always guaranteed. For unmarried women, things became more complicated and more peculiar. Some physicians took it upon themselves to assist in the therapeutic process, claiming that manual stimulation was a necessary medical procedure to induce what they described as hysterical paroxysm. That phrase, wrapped in layers of professional vocabulary, was essentially their way of describing orgasm without ever having to say the word. The procedure was often performed in the doctor's office, behind closed doors, with all the air of a routine checkup. And while it may sound scandalous to us now, the Victorians framed it as purely clinical, an impersonal act in the service of health. Some women even reported feeling relieved afterward, though in those days, their experiences were rarely documented in their own words. By the late 19th century, this treatment inspired the invention of mechanical devices, early vibrators, that promised to speed up the process and spare doctors the manual labor. Advertised in catalogs as muscle massagers or circulatory stimulants, these machines quietly made their way into homes under the guise of legitimate medical equipment. I can't help but feel conflicted when I think about this. On one hand, there's something almost comical about the idea of Victorian doctors earnestly turning a crank or plugging in a strange contraption in the name of health. On the other, it's a stark reminder of how medicine can be shaped as much by cultural attitudes as by scientific understanding. And those cultural attitudes, about morality, gender, and who gets to decide what's healthy, are where this story turns from odd medical history into a mirror reflecting the entire society of the time. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, these so-called treatments weren't just about medicine, they were about reinforcing an entire social order. In Victorian society, a woman's health was often defined by how well she fit her prescribed role: obedient wife, dutiful daughter, quiet presence. If she was unhappy, restless, or simply unwilling to conform, it wasn't framed as a personal struggle, it was labeled a medical condition. That's what still unsettles me the most. This prescription didn't just treat symptoms, it shaped lives. It reinforced the belief that a woman's body ultimately existed for the service of others. Even under the respectable banner of healthcare, it blurred the line between healing and control, between a doctor's authority and society's expectations. Think about it. A husband could take his wife to the doctor, hear that increased intimacy was good for her health, and suddenly, his desires were not only socially acceptable, they were medically sanctioned. That changes the dynamic entirely, turning what could be a private choice into a public obligation. For women without husbands, the implications were just as telling. The medical profession's willingness to step into such intimate territory reveals how deeply power and propriety were intertwined. A doctor could frame the most personal act as a clinical necessity. And the patient, living in a culture that revered male authority, would have little room to question it. Of course, not every physician had ulterior motives. Many truly believed they were helping. But whether intentional or not, these treatments upheld a system where women's autonomy was secondary to the opinions and prescriptions of men. And that's why, even though the science behind these cures has long been debunked, the cultural echoes are still worth noticing. Because when you see how easily medicine can be shaped by social values, you start to wonder, what practices today will future generations look back on with the same mix of disbelief and discomfort? And as we move toward the end of this story, it's time to see how the Victorian sex cure finally lost its grip on medicine, and what its strange legacy tells us about the journey from superstition to science. By the early 20th century, the Victorian sex cure began to fade, not because society suddenly became more enlightened about intimacy, but because science finally started catching up. Germ theory, hormonal research, and psychology began offering real explanations for symptoms that had once been swept into the vague catch-all of hysteria. The old idea that a woman's health depended on her sexual availability looked increasingly flimsy under the light of actual evidence. Mechanical vibrators, once marketed as discreet medical devices, quietly moved into the realm of personal goods, and physicians stopped offering manual therapy as part of their practice. Hospitals and clinics shifted toward treatments based on biology rather than moral prescription. And the word hysteria itself, once a common diagnosis, was officially dropped from the medical vocabulary in the mid-20th century. But here's the thing that stays with me. The story isn't just about bad science being corrected. It's about how deeply social values can shape what we call medicine. The Victorian era wrapped morality, gender roles, and authority into the very heart of its healthcare system. And when I look at our modern world, I can't help but wonder, what beliefs are we still carrying into medicine today that future generations will shake their heads at? This is why I think stories like this matter. They remind us that science is not just about facts and data, it's about people, cultures, and the values we allow to steer our decisions. And sometimes, what we think of as progress is really just a slow peeling back of layers we never questioned. So, the next time you hear about a miracle cure or a proven treatment, maybe pause and ask yourself, what assumptions are hiding underneath? Because history shows us that those assumptions can be just as powerful as the treatment itself. If you found this glimpse into Victorian medicine as fascinating, and a little unsettling, as I did, don't just let it fade away when the video ends. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who loves strange history. And subscribe so you don't miss the next forgotten story that might just change the way you see the past and the present.